Hello everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 79th episode of the Writ Podcast. Who was Canada's greatest Prime Minister? Who was Canada's greatest opposition leader? At least in the public's mind. Pollara asked this question to Canadians in December between the 8th and the 20th. They surveyed 4,020 Canadians online, and we have the results. I've been writing about them on the Writ.ca, and today, to discuss it on the podcast, I'm joined by Dan Arnold, who's Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara, who also polled for the Liberals during their last campaigns, and I'm also joined by Stephen Azzi, Professor at the Clayton H. Riddell Graduate Program in Political Management at Carleton University. Dan, Stephen, thanks so much for joining me.
Eric. Thank you.
Dan, maybe you should start with just the polling numbers. Give us, and we'll start talking about the prime ministers. We'll get to the opposition leaders afterwards. But just focusing on who Canadians thought was the greatest prime minister in our history. What did your poll find?
Yes, this is a poll that we fielded in December, and a big sample size. And as anyone who's read your articles can see, that lets you get very granular down to all the different subgroups, which I'm sure we'll get into a bit today. But basically, we asked people, in your opinion, who was the greatest prime minister in Canadian history? Gave them a list of the prime ministers who'd served the longest. They could write in votes as well as if they wanted to, and a few people did write in votes. But the big finding is the greatest prime minister ever is Mr. Don't Know. 40% of Canadians didn't want to hazard a guess, but among those who did make a guess, who were bold enough to stake their claim to who the greatest prime minister was, Pierre Trudeau and Stephen Harper were at the top of the list, and then you've got MacDonald, Mulroney, Chrétien, and Pearson, and the younger Trudeau, who all got a fair number of votes as well too.
And who came out last?
Robert Borden sadly led Canada through World War I, but no respect among the ones at least that we probed on. There were a few write-in votes I mentioned. I think Kim Campbell, Paul Martin. Somebody wrote in Kim MacDonald as their write-in vote, so I don't know how we want to assign that one. But yes, unfortunately for Borden, even R.B. Bennett beat him, which is maybe a bit of an ignominious title there, distinction.
Yeah, we limited the list to 14, and we chose the 14 who had served for at least 4 years, which gave us a pretty good list. After that, it would have been those who only served for a little time, like Paul Martin was the one who I think was next on the list that we didn't include. But then it would be other people like John Thompson or Mackenzie Bowl, people from the 1890s who served for a couple of years. Stephen, you've done this kind of survey before, but not from the public. You've looked at what experts have said, people who study politics, people who study history. We'll get into some of the details a bit more, but when you first saw the results, what was your reaction to them?
Well, I was struck at how poorly the historical prime ministers had done. And by that I mean people we don't remember, people we don't know firsthand. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that Canadians don't really know their history very well. It was striking that nobody did well who wasn't alive in my lifetime.
Yeah, John M. MacDonald was the only one who got into, I think, the double digits among decideds. But beyond that, you really had to go back really far. So, Dan, what does that say about the recency bias of the poll? Because, as mentioned, this wasn't of experts, people who study history. It included, 60% of the respondents gave an opinion, though, a lot of it, as we said, Mackenzie King, Louis Saint Laurent, Wilfrid Laurier, people who generally rate very highly on the historical rankings, were in the low single digits. They just did not come to mind. So that recency bias does seem to have been a big factor here.
Yeah, the 40% don't know really struck me. I was expecting a high don't know number on the opposition leader question, because I think that's asking a lot of people to have an opinion on a topic like that when it's not really covered in history books by and large, and they probably wouldn't have stumbled upon a lot of. There's not a CBC miniseries on George Trudeau or anything like that, right? So nice. I wasn't surprised on that one. I think on the PM one, though, seeing 40% who don't know did strike me a little bit, because the reality is of surveys, if somebody's willing to take the time to do a survey, it's usually because they like sharing their opinions. And we've talked about this before. Often on surveys, I'll even toss fake questions on of nonsensical events. People still give their opinion even when it's not real. Even a couple of years ago, I remember when I was doing some testing around the Trudeau brand and the Trudeau name, we wanted to kind of see how people felt about Pierre Trudeau, and I tested for one of the many prime minister names how they felt about George Kirk, who sounds like a prime minister name from days of yore, but is actually Captain Kirk's father. And you had 8% of Canadians said, he was a good prime minister. 6% said he was a bad prime minister. So, people are willing to put their opinion out on a lot of topics, even when those topics aren't real. So the fact that there were still 40% who weren't willing to put their name to kind of pick a name on this one, I think does stand out a little bit. And as you've alluded to there, the names that often top these academic lists of the experts, the Lauriers, the Kings, they were down at 2%, 3% overall in terms of their support. So I think this definitely does speak to certainly a recency bias. On our website, you can see we plotted out the vote totals for each prime minister over how long it's been since they left office, and there's a very clear correlation where the more recent prime ministers are selected much more often. Maybe it just means the more recent prime ministers are better prime ministers, but I think most people would probably disagree with that if you ask them directly other ways about that sort of thing. So I do think it does speak to just people not having a lot of that historical context to at least be able to feel like they can judge these types of questions.
Stephen, when you've done this and surveyed, the experts, what has been the rankings? What's generally what we see when we ask people who've looked into this or thought about it?
So I've done this twice with Norman Hilmer at Carleton University, and Norman did it once before with Jack Granatstein from York University. And all three of these surveys done for Maclean's had the same top three, although it was a different order each time. And the top three are MacDonald, Laurier, and Mackenzie King. And it's striking that Mackenzie King and Laurier, two long-serving, successful prime ministers, show up nowhere in the Pollara poll of the general public.
Is it a surprise to you that MacDonald still scores so highly in these polls? Now, obviously, you've done these surveys before. There's a lot of discussion about the residential schools, but he does seem to have been successful, at least up to that point. And now when we see it also in the public opinion, that his image does seem to have been cemented in a lot of Canadians' mind as one of our greatest prime ministers.
Well, and it's interesting because there's a lot of debate about MacDonald right now, particularly his role in the residential schools situation, crisis, if you will. I think what's happening is people are hearing the name MacDonald and they're having a reaction either pro-MacDonald or anti-MacDonald, and I think that helps keep MacDonald in the public consciousness, and that's what we're seeing in this poll.
So what does that say to someone like Mackenzie King, who has been prime minister for longer than anybody else? And he did really poorly in the poll. I would have thought that he was someone who would have done a little bit better. Wilfrid Laurier, he's on the one of the dollars. I can't remember which one. I haven't used cash in forever. But he scored a little bit higher. He did well in Quebec because he's a Quebecer. Mackenzie King was nowhere, so we don't seem to have much of a memory of those beyond maybe MacDonald, maybe Laurier. And then after that, they really do seem to just fade back into our historical memory.
No, that's exactly right. And I think it might speak to our education system, actually, and to the fact that enrollments in history courses in university are declining. We seem to be a country that's losing track of its history, and this has nothing to do with pulling down statues. I actually think the debate about statues is helpful. And I think this might be one of the things that's helping MacDonald right now is there is a debate about MacDonald. There is no debate about Mackenzie King or Laurier, though there should be. There are questions to ask about both those prime ministers.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dan, this does, as Stephen just said, when this is entering into the debate, people will start to take a position on it, right? That if you're for or against John A. Macdonald, that means something about your politics. And I think that we also see it in terms of the partisanship in the results for the Best Prime Minister poll, that Liberals tended to choose Liberals, Conservatives tended to choose Conservatives, New Democrats had to choose someone, so they often chose Liberals. But what role did partisanship play in people's responses in this survey?
Yeah, so that was a major factor here. And I will say, the way this question is asked, we're asking people to pick one name from the list, and although these men did become prime minister thanks to the first past the post system, many of them have kind of learned the horrors of the first past the post system in terms of how they did here, in the sense that if you're everybody's second choice or their third choice for prime ministers, you don't get a lot of points on a poll like this, and you kind of get overlooked. And maybe some of these more mainstream, centrist, less interesting prime ministers who don't instill a lot of strong emotion finish a bit lower down the list, whereas the ones who still have that strong emotional base, and a lot of that is built through partisanship, they did a bit better. I mentioned the top two on this list were Pierre Trudeau and Stephen Harper, and clearly a lot of that is driven by partisanship. Pierre Trudeau was the top choice among Liberal voters. 23% of Liberals picked him as their top choice. Justin Trudeau was actually number 2 among Liberal voters, whereas Harper was the first choice of 26% of Conservatives and virtually not picked at all. He got 2% of Liberal voters, 4% of NDP voters. His vote is almost all coming from Conservative voters. So there was definitely a partisanship factor in play. In pretty much every case, other than when you get down to the people like King and Laurier who are a bit lower down the list, but among the top 6 or 7 vote getters, without exception, they all did better among people who currently would lean towards the same party that they ran for themselves and were elected under.
I did find it interesting that Brian Mulroney did so well among Quebecers, primarily Bloc Québécois voters, and did really poorly everywhere else. It was almost that he was the only option that was palatable for Bloc voters having to choose a prime minister, someone who tried to push the Meech Lake Accord through that would have given more powers to Quebec. Seems to have helped him a little bit, though at the time, of course, the creation of the Bloc Québécois was a result of dissatisfaction with Brian Mulroney. Stephen, I don't know if you had any thoughts on how that kind of played out in terms of the partisanship and some of the names that popped up.
Well, it was striking that the Conservatives consistently preferred Conservative prime ministers and the Liberals consistently preferred Liberal prime ministers. And I think some of this goes to the fact that the public doesn't really understand what leadership's about. As long as somebody's voicing the views that we share, we consider them a good leader. And if they voice different views, they're a bad leader. But I think the public doesn't understand there's a heck of a lot more to leadership than just what you have to say. This is how we end up with Donald Trump, for example.
What do you think about the fact that Liberals chose Pierre Trudeau, who goes back to obviously the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, so quite a long time ago, but Conservatives chose Stephen Harper. Liberals today weren't choosing Justin Trudeau or Jean Chrétien, who's also a recent prime minister. That Pierre Trudeau still seems to be the ideal for the Liberals, but for Conservatives, Stephen Harper was what came to mind.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it shows that there are different factors at play. It's not just partisanship or recency. There must be something more going on. I think in the case of Harper, it's because he's the founder of the party. He's the savior of the Conservative movement in Canada. In the case of Pierre Trudeau, I think he's the one that best enunciated a particular brand of liberalism. And he was charismatic, and he was quotable, and frankly, he was confrontational as well. Trudeau's a memorable figure. None of that applies to Harper. I think in Harper's case, it's because of his role in uniting the parties that created the modern day Conservative Party.
I'd also be curious to hear your thoughts on the image that we have of Pierre Trudeau today, that it has endured to the extent that he can still be someone who wins a poll like this. How has that image, do you think, managed to survive the decade since he's gone?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to the issues that I was mentioning earlier, the charisma and the confrontation and the quotability. But there's another factor too, and that is that he's a polarizing figure, as was Stephen Harper. So you'll remember about 15 years ago, the CBC ran a series on the greatest Canadian, and Pierre Trudeau placed third. And then Canada's History magazine did a little cheeky thing. They had a poll, a public poll, of the worst Canadian, and Pierre Trudeau won. So he was the third best Canadian and also the worst Canadian. And I suspect this poll, if Pollara had also asked who's the worst prime minister, number 1 and 2, I don't know which order, would have been Pierre Trudeau and Stephen Harper. So these are polarizing figures who are, because they're polarizing, deeply attractive to their own followers.
Maybe Robert Borden and Wilfrid Laurier need to work on their charisma, historical charisma and confrontation. Borden doing so poorly. Dan, regionalism also seemed to be a factor here. It's hard to separate that, I guess, from partisanship. Stephen Harper doing well in Western Canada, which is also where Conservatives do well. But you did see that kind of thing. Mulroney did well in Quebec. You had people like Chrétien who did a lot better in Atlantic Canada, for example. What kind of role did that play in some of these responses?
Yeah, there was actually a fair bit of a regional factor here. I mean, Mulroney is the most interesting case, as you were alluding to before, in the sense that he won Quebec by more than 2 times anybody else in terms of Quebec, in terms of who people felt were the greatest prime minister. But that was driven primarily by Bloc voters. He was the first choice by a ratio of 4-1 over anybody else among Bloc voters. So, I think there's certainly among that kind of soft nationalist sentiment in Quebec still a lot of goodwill towards Mulroney. And we've seen that in recent election campaigns. The current Conservative leaders at times have tried to cozy up a little bit to Mulroney, and that's really a Quebec play more than anything else, because his numbers were not very good in the rest of the country there. So that one definitely stood out to me. Beyond that, you definitely see Harper, stronger in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Diefenbaker also doing quite well on the prairies. So, there's definitely some other regional dynamics in play here. Though, Pierre Trudeau, even in BC, where he didn't win a ton of seats, was still number one. So, I think there's still going to be pockets of that sentiment in other places. Pierre Trudeau was number 3 in Alberta, and I think this again speaks to that kind of polarizing feature there, even though if you polled Albertans overall an disapproval of Pierre Trudeau, not a lot there, but if you actually still find that pocket of progressives there, there's still going to be a following even in those other parts of the country. Stephen Harper was number 3 in Quebec. Again, he's not necessarily beloved province-wide, but you're going to find, sub-pockets even in places where these guys didn't win a lot of seats that still look back very positively towards them.
Stephen, when you've done these surveys of experts, have you seen a regional disparity in the same way?
Not as much at all. There is a definite tilt towards Mulroney in Quebec. There's a more tolerance of Diefenbaker in Saskatchewan, but for the most part, you don't see the same disparities that we see with the public.
So there is a difference there that between our public memory and sort of the expert memory. It's not just regionalism or partisanship.
Yeah, and to give another example, when you ask the experts who's the greatest prime minister, the Conservatives in our poll chose Mackenzie King. They didn't choose a Conservative. So when you're talking to the experts, and by experts we mean primarily historians and political scientists, these biases are less obvious than they are with the public.
Let's move on to the opposition leader results, which I think also in a way have some mirror to the best prime minister. Dan, take us through what those showed.
Yeah, so I'd say on this list we limited it to people who never became prime minister. I know you had your podcast with Aaron Weary a few weeks back, and some of the high picks there were people like Laurier who went on to become prime minister. So we limited this specifically to opposition leaders and official opposition leaders, we said, who never became prime minister, and limited the list to 14 as well. Again, just to kind of have that symmetry there. Again, there were a few write-in votes for. Even though Tommy Douglas was never an official opposition leader, he's got a following too. I think he was number 1 on greatest Canadian that Stephen alluded to many years before. So a few people found a way to still get him onto the ballot there. But among the choices that we put forward, this one wasn't even close at all. You still had a high 4 and 10 who didn't have an opinion, who weren't able to put a guess on it, which again didn't surprise me a lot, given these are not necessarily figures who have schools named after them, who are they don't have airports named after them. But Jack Layton did come out number 1, 28% overall picked Layton, which is about half of the people who were able to name a name on this list pick Layton. And then there's a big drop off there. You're down to Bouchard at 5%, Preston Manning at 5%, Robert Stanfield, who's the only real pre-90s figure that he comes anywhere close to the top of this list at 4%. And then you're back to the more recent ones: Mulcair, O'Toole, Scheer, Dion, Ignatieff, and Stockwell Day even. So a lot of recency bias on this question here, with Layton running the table pretty much with every demographic. Even PPC voters pick Layton as their first choice. He spanned the political spectrum here, and every way you can slice and dice the data, by age, by gender, by income, Layton was the clear-cut first choice in this question.
Stephen, what were your reactions to those numbers? Now, I know you've looked primarily at prime ministers, but to see Jack Layton score so highly, for example.
I was surprised, but when I thought about it a bit more, it makes a lot of sense. If you're a Liberal, who are you going to choose? You're going to choose Jack Layton because it makes Stéphane Dion, Michael Ignatieff look a little better. If there was something phenomenally good about Jack Layton, it sort of justifies what happened to the Liberal Party in those years. And I think with Conservatives as well. He was a formidable force. Among New Democrats, my New Democrat friends guarantee me that had he lived, he would have become prime minister. All the rest of the opposition leaders were failures. They didn't achieve their goal. In Layton's case, his life was cut short, and so we never will know if he could have been prime minister. And I think that adds a certain cachet to his name.
Yeah, I really think that's the case
that's a
in
good
this
point, yeah.
situation here, where you've got, all these people were official opposition leaders, or most of them were before they ran in their final election. So, the fact that they lost their final election probably means Canadians didn't like them much at the time, and it certainly left probably a foul taste in people's mouths. Most of them, their story ended with failure because they were rejected by voters. But Layton, the last chapter in his last election was a resounding success because he was coming from third, fourth party status to get to the official opposition, and then his story ends in tragedy, which obviously, leaves people feeling much differently than had he been a polarizing figure in politics for another 4 years and maybe lost another election. I think that could have maybe even left a more sour taste in people's mouths. But I think because of the way the story kind of ends for him, it leaves people with that deep reverence and almost makes him a larger than life figure, which is why he sticks out here. And number 2 on this list is Lucien Bouchard, who again was never really running to be prime minister, so you can't really say that he ever failed in terms of what he was hoping to accomplish there. And I think the fact that those politicians didn't really have a bad election where they were rejected by voters, it probably partly explains why they do so well on the poll here.
Yeah, because Lucien Bouchard, after he left the official opposition role, went to Quebec and did win an election, right? So he doesn't have an election defeat under him like most of these other leaders do, and which is why they're official opposition leaders only. Stephen, if the experts were asked to do this, do you think the list would be a lot different?
Oh, I'm sure it would be. If you do the same thing that Dan has done, which is you leave out people who eventually became prime minister, it becomes more complicated, because I suspect a consensus would form around Lester Pearson as the greatest opposition leader. But even if you exclude those people, there were a lot of impressive opposition leaders historically that aren't part of the public consciousness right now. Robert Stanfield being the most obvious one. It was often said that he was the greatest prime minister we never had. But there were others, if you reach back, who were very impressive individuals, but just never became prime minister.
I suppose it's not surprising that figures like John Bracken or Robert Mannion or George Drew scored so lowly. It's when you put it up against the fact that people like Mackenzie King and Robert Borden could score so lowly. But Stephen, do we just forget these people after a couple decades if they never became prime minister? They just disappear from our historical memory?
To a large extent, yes. And even among historians, there's no scholarly biography of Bracken or George Drew or John Mannion. Robert Mannion. See, I can't even get the name right. But there are scholarly biographies of Mackenzie King and Laurier and MacDonald. There was an effort to write a biography, a collective biography of the leaders of the opposition in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. The book was titled "The Men Who Would Be King." I thought it was quite a clever title. The author couldn't find a publisher for it.
Yeah, that kind of says it. I've had a personal project of finding biographies of all of the past party leaders and prime ministers and premiers and all that. I've had a lot of difficulty with some of them. I did find one on Bracken because he was, premier for Manitoba for 20 years. But the other ones have been very difficult to find. So my collection is not going to be complete. Finding ones of people like Tommy Douglas or other leaders like that, MJ Coldwell, for example, a bit easier. For some reason, those leaders, despite the fact they never even became close to becoming prime minister, were able to get into the public memory a bit more than some of these conservative opposition leaders who are just remembered as losers who never even came close. This was during the time of the Liberal dominance. Dan, we do see, as you mentioned it, Layton has all this cross-partisan appeal. And Stephen did mention it. If you're a Liberal, who are you going to choose? Michael Ignatieff, I think, was the top Liberal among Liberals here. But it is still remarkable that Layton would do so well among Conservatives, among Bloc voters, People's Party, Green. What does that say about his legacy, I guess?
Yeah, and I mean, he was, I mentioned he led among PPC voters, beat out Andrew Scheer, nearly won a demographic for us, which would have been a great title for him, but Layton still beat him among PPC voters. But more interestingly, I mean, Layton was first among Bloc voters over Bouchard even. So I think, and first among Conservatives, he beat Preston Manning by a 2-to-1 ratio there. So, clearly even people who may not have liked his politics at the time I think a lot of current Bloc voters probably did vote for Layton back in the day. I don't think a lot of current Conservative voters would have voted for Layton back in the day, but I think there was still a certain level of respect there. And I think, again, the fact that maybe he kind of came in on this wave and didn't have that long period where he was this confrontational opposition leader. Had he spent 4 years screaming about how terrible Stephen Harper was, Conservatives may have been left with a much more distasteful opinion of him over time. Had there been another election where it was very clear-cut, Harper versus Layton, and there were negative ads from the Conservative machine against Layton running around the clock, again, that may have fueled the partisanship a bit more into this type of question. But I think the fact that he died tragically, and maybe didn't have that same, it didn't expose him to the same level of partisanship backlash that I think a lot of these other figures probably do get saddled with over time.
Stephen, I'd be curious if you think that our memory of some of these leaders is partly shaped by who they were up against, because if you do, it could just be the fact that we're talking about partisanship and time. But you do see this mirror, right, where Pierre Trudeau did quite well in the poll. Robert Stanfield did pretty good compared to how badly everyone did. But Robert Stanfield still made it into the top. You had Stephen Harper, who was ranked highly, but then you also had Jack Layton. When you had Jean Chrétien and Mulroney, but you also had Manning and Bouchard. So it does seem like, in a way, maybe your kind of image, your historical memory, is somewhat shaped by your opponent. Pierre Trudeau had René Lévesque. That was a big battle that we still remember today. But Mackenzie King versus George Drew, maybe it wasn't that exciting.
No, that's absolutely true. And it's a complicated relationship. You can say prime ministers are lucky if they face weak opposition leaders. You can also say that opposition leaders are going to be weak if they're facing strong prime ministers. And it's hard to know. It's a chicken and egg thing. I have a colleague who's always saying how lucky it was that Jean Chrétien faced weak opposition leaders. And I keep thinking those leaders might have been stronger had they faced a weaker prime minister.
It was Jean Chrétien's fault that Stockwell Day wasn't a great leader in 2000. Dan, you do public opinion research. Now, this was my idea to do this question. You very graciously asked if I wanted to have a question added to this poll, and this is what I came up with. Is there a value for doing this kind of public opinion research?
Yeah, I think this is good to get on the get in the public domain. It's not a topic where we looked around. There really wasn't a lot of other polling from the general public that had been done on this topic. Personally, I find this interesting. I have actually have a Canadian history undergraduate degree. Back when I was blogging many years ago, I used to run little contests like this where people would vote for the best prime minister we never had and things like that. So, it's a personal interest for me. And I think, the fact that we see so many Canadians who don't have an opinion on topics like this, shows that there's probably room for more discussion on these types of topics out there, and anything to kind of get a bit more information out there into the public domain on a topic like this, I think only helps fuel this discussion and maybe creates a few little debates that let people Google somebody and find out about, I see this George Drew guy on the poll here. Let me find out a little bit about him. Or I had never heard about Mackenzie King and Wilfrid Laurier before. Maybe I'll try to find out a bit more about them. So, hopefully it helps pique a little bit of more interest in Canadian history among people.
Stephen, you've done these surveys of historians and political scientists. When you see these kinds of results versus the work that you've done, what does it make you think about how we remember our history in Canada, and also maybe how you might approach a future survey of experts in the future?
Well, what this survey tells me, it's nothing new. It's that Canadians don't know their history. And it's a pretty sad state of affairs. It's from the point of view of civic engagement, people need to know where the country comes from, both the positive and the negative in our history. And we're failing somehow in educating people about Canadian history. And it's not just schools. It's the national network, it's the television network, radio network that don't do a good job. So anytime somebody like Dan and you want to create some sort of debate, even if it's just for a few days, it's helpful to the cause. And this is what motivated Norman Hilmer and I to do these surveys. It wasn't so much that it matters whether a bunch of experts think Mackenzie King was a better prime minister than Wilfrid Laurier. It matters that Maclean's is going to devote 3 or 4 pages to the issue of historic prime ministers, and that this is going to engender a debate, and I'll get snarky tweets directed at me and so on. It's all part of elevating or increasing Canadian knowledge of our history.
Well, I'm glad then, Dan, we were able to contribute a little bit. And as you said, I hope some people will look up some of these past leaders, especially Edward Blake, and they can find out how awful he was, in my view. Anyway, so Stephen and Dan, I really appreciate you coming on, chatting about this, and let's hope that it does spur a few conversations beyond just this podcast.
Yeah, this is great. Maybe we'll do a greatest agriculture minister or something like that next year to keep Canadians excited on this topic.
All right, it's a date for you guys.
I'd love
Thanks.
to do an all-star cabinet, a survey of experts on who would you choose for each of the major cabinet posts. I think that would be an interesting experiment.
All right, Dan, we have our next the next poll that you can do. See how many people can name a past foreign affairs minister. Well, that'll be really illuminating. All right, well, thanks so much, guys. It was a lot of fun to chat with you, and thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.